Hello there, friends. It's day 10 of October and time for the 10th illustration out of the 31 for this month. So, for today's illustration, the prompt is Nomad. Now, obviously, I've named my character Nomad 31, and now you get the reason, right, why I have done that. So, for a nomadic person like Nomad 31 here, and in this post apocalyptic scenario, it is obviously important for him to keep moving. He cannot stay in one place for a very long period of time, not only due to the fact that enemies are out there scouting for the survivors or there is some sort of a threat, but also due to the fact that the resources in these conditions, the resources in a pretty much destroyed environment, is not going to last very long. And as we had seen in one of the previous illustrations, that there was actually a huge crowd of these nomadic survivors who were entering the city. So obviously, there's going to be a shortage of resources very, very soon because all they are able to survive upon is what they have scavenged from the ruins of the war. Scavenging is a very important thing. It becomes a very important thing when you are gathering resources in such an environment. And in this illustration, Nomad was actually able to find a motorcycle and somehow he was able to get it to work, and he is on his way out of sector 13. Making this illustration brings a very interesting caveat into the whole picture. This is one of the first illustrations where we see a direct interaction between a main character and a non-living object. A motorcycle is a non-living object, right? I mean, yeah, for all the motorcyclists out there who consider their motorcycles a friend, I know I'm hurting your feelings a bit, but listen to me here. The motorcycle is a non-living object, and when you are drawing a motorcycle, it's more like drawing a still life image. But Nomad 31 here, he is alive, he's a human being, and combining still life study with life study is what we are going to explore in today's podcast. So, grab your cup of coffee, get your favorite snacks, and enjoy the show. If you have read about Guptill, if you have read about how he used to illustrate, if you have read his works, then you might be knowing that there are certain techniques which are to be followed in pen and ink drawing. Now, why am I referring Guptill here and not any other artist? Where there are a lot of artists who are very talented, but Guptill is one whom you should really follow if you're a beginner. Guptill was very much celebrated for bringing this sort of a meticulous detail, sort of a life-defining detail into his illustrations. He was able to imagine things and he was able to make them lifelike through ink drawings. And he defined many types of still life techniques as well as life drawing techniques in his books. Today, I'm going to be using much of those techniques as an outline for this podcast. When you're drawing still life imagery, for example, a motorcycle here, still life images or still life objects have very well defined planes and shapes. They have well defined silhouettes which will not change over time in a particular scene. So, for example, if a motorcycle looks a certain way, moving from point A to point B, unless it falls down, unless it crashes, or unless there is a huge change in movement, the overall silhouette is going to remain the same. The planes, the curves, the overall shape of every part remains the same. So what you need as a primary step in your still life drawing techniques is careful observation and composition. Observation refers to closely observing the subject which you have at hand, noticing the shapes, the textures, and the values which you need to capture the essence of this object. And composition obviously means the way in which you arrange the objects, because the way in which you arrange an object, the way in which you place an object in a scene is going to define your area of visual interest, and it creates the scope for interaction of your still life imagery with the live subjects of your artwork. Next comes the value study for your still life imagery. Now, value study is applicable to both still life as well as life drawings, because the values, the type of tonality which you're going to use, identifying the darkest regions as well as the lightest regions of your drawing is very important if you are going to make a believable and relatable illustration. Lighting is everything in making a scene stand out, and the use of values is going to also bring out the contrast between the subject and the background, between the foreground and the background elements, and obviously you can emphasize the different forms, the shapes, and create depth in your image by using these values. The next thing is perspective. I have discussed about perspective also in a previous podcast, and it's all about determining in which direction all these parallel lines are going to go. If you are drawing from a single point perspective or a 2-point perspective, it is all going to define how everything is propped up, shaped, and it is going to give you a good idea of how your composition is going to look by the end of your drawing. Now, having vanishing points is a very good idea when you're drawing still life imagery, because if you're drawing multiple objects at a time, what this will do is it will help you define the scale of the different objects. So for instance, things which are in the foreground are obviously going to look bigger. They will be closer to the viewer, and hence the size will be larger as compared to objects, or even the same object which will lie farther away from the viewer's eyes. So having a perspective, determining the perspective and keeping it constant throughout your drawing is going to determine the scale of the images, the scale of the objects which you use in your illustration. And finally, the texture. For a motorcycle, most of the parts are going to be made out of metal or plastic, which is going to be smooth. The surface is smooth. The light will reflect from a particular plane. That will be constant for a particular direction of light, and it will depend upon the way in which the light is hitting the surface. So for this illustration, the light source actually lies behind the character on the other side. So most of the illustration which you will see here lies in the shadow. Our character as well as the motorcycle, they lie in a shadow region. But the smoke, the dust which comes out from the rear end of this motorcycle, the dust which is kicked up by the wheels, it all catches the light from the background, because remember, as I've said before, materials and matter plays a huge role in the way in which light behaves. Smoke is not opaque if you think about it. Smoke does let some light through. The particles which are kicked up, the dust which forms, also lets some light through. And this is the type of visual quality which you need to maintain in your illustrations as well. Making things translucent, making things transparent. You need to pay attention to these things if you're planning on making good textures. Now, coming to the different life drawing techniques which matter in your illustration. Life drawing has a huge number of techniques and huge number of rules which need to be followed. But understanding these rules is very difficult if you just go by the book, because you need to actually start drawing. The interaction between the live subjects in your illustration and the still life imagery in your illustration is going to be very important. The complementarity that is established, the contrast that exists, and the narrative and symbolism which you use are all going to play a very important role in creating that bond between the non-living and the living. So the motorcycle here is non-living, and my character, he is trying to gain speed. So he's hunching onto the tank of this motorcycle and he's making himself smaller. He's making himself more aerodynamic in order to gain more speed. He's reducing the wind resistance. This is what you need to keep in mind. This very thing, how your subject is going to interact with the non-living object, with the still life imagery in your illustration. So once you have actually set the proportions right, once you have actually positioned non-living object, a motorcycle here for instance, what remains is to establish a believable interaction between the human, between my character Nomad 31 and this motorcycle. And to do this, what you need is knowledge of the underlying structure of the human body. If you imagine it in a very simplified form, the human body is actually made up of cylinders and multiple spheres. You have a sphere for a head, you have cylinders for the arms, you again have multiple spheres for the joints. And remember that these spheres and cylinders, they are very dynamic. There is a lot of dynamism when it comes to life drawing. The way your muscles bend, the way your muscles contract and relax, the way your joints bend, the way your skin stretches, the way the fabric stretches over joints matters a lot in creating dynamism, in creating a believable concept of an interaction between a human being and an object. Knowing about the underlying structure, about the interconnection of the different parts of the body, the proportions and the anatomy, understanding the proportions in relation to the different objects plays an important role in constructing the whole scene. And obviously there comes value again, the light and shadow and the value range. It is all very defining when it comes to making the scene relatable. So it all boils down to this interaction between the still life and the live elements. And when you are combining the still life and the live elements, the interaction between them can enhance the overall composition and storytelling. Again, we land at the same place. This is a very important storytelling tool, because throughout your storyline, even if you're illustrating a comic or you're illustrating a manga, throughout your storyline there are going to be multiple points when your character, your live drawing character, is going to interact with multiple non-living objects, with multiple still life elements. And if you're following these techniques and having a good consideration and idea of the interaction between the still life and the live elements, then you can create compelling and expressive illustrations that capture the essence of your subjects. And finally, the thing which matters a lot when you are making an illustration which tells a story is symbolism. As I said in my previous video, that symbolism is the symbolic meaning of things. When you are making something in your illustration, there should be a purpose behind it, and the symbolism which you are using should justify that purpose. For instance, in this illustration, the purpose of Nomad 31 to search for a motorcycle was the fact that he wanted to move more quickly between different destinations. And the symbolism which I used here was he wanted to go quick. I used some blurry smoke effects, some blurry dust effects, and this position of his, the positioning of my character in a way where he is in a hurry, in a way where he's trying to gain speed. This all symbolizes the fact that he's trying to escape this war-struck city as soon as possible. So ultimately, including all these elements in your illustration, starting all the way from structure and form to symbolism, everything is going to play an important role in making your illustration relatable and in the storytelling part of your illustration. So I hope that this quick guide, this podcast in which I discuss the tips, helps you in your art journey in combining the different still life as well as the live elements of your illustrations, and you are able to use this to progress in your art journey. I'll see you tomorrow in the next video with a new concept. Till then, take care, be creative, peace.